The sun beat down over the dry earth of Kathithiama village, a quiet rural patch in Kenya's Machakos County. It was 1955, and 6-year-old Charles Mutua Muli stood alone in the scorching heat, barefoot and confused. The scent of dust and smoke hung in the air, but the small boy's senses were overwhelmed by something else entirely. Silence. His family was gone. No explanation. No farewell. Just gone. He ran from hut to hut, called out names he knew, searched the paths through the bush. Nothing. The world had shifted in an instant from a place of fragile comfort to a wilderness of uncertainty. Hunger soon followed. Then fear. And then a realization. He was now on his own. At night, he curled up beneath trees or in alleyways. During the day, he wandered aimlessly, knocking on doors, begging for food, hoping for scraps. Some people ignored him, others kicked him away. A few shared bits of maize or gave him odd jobs, but never for long. No one wanted a hungry boy with no family and no name that mattered. Charles was no longer a son. He had become a street child. In towns like Kangundo, children like him were invisible. Yet in the quiet corners of his heart, Charles clung to something he didn't fully understand. Hope. It was stubborn and silent, a flickering ember refusing to go out. Years passed. He learned how to survive, how to keep moving, and how to protect himself in a world that had turned cold. But deep down, Charles wanted something more. Not just food, not just shelter. He wanted to belong. He had no idea that his footsteps, though bare and blistered, were leading him somewhere extraordinary. Charles Muli was 16 when he first heard something that pierced through the chaos of his life like a beam of light. It came from a small, dusty church on the edge of a settlement where he'd wandered in search of food. The singing caught his attention first, voices rising in harmony, raw and beautiful. He hesitated at the doorway, torn between curiosity and the fear of being chased away again. But no one shouted. No one pushed him out. Instead, someone smiled. For the first time in a long while, Charles felt seen, not as a street child or a burden, but simply as a person. That day, he stayed for the whole service, and when it ended, he stayed longer, drawn by the warmth and kindness that seemed to hover in the air like a soft cloud. People spoke of love, redemption, purpose. These were words he barely understood, but something about them took root in his heart. That visit became 2, then 3, and soon Charles was attending regularly. One evening, while sitting quietly in a pew, a strange calm fell over him. His thoughts slowed. His breath deepened. It was as if something, or someone, was telling him, "You are not forgotten. You were never forgotten." That moment became a turning point. Charles decided he could not stay in that village any longer. If he wanted a different life, he would have to seek it. And so, with no money, no belongings, and only his determination for company, he set off on foot, 70 kilometers to Nairobi. The journey took days. His feet blistered. Hunger gnawed at him. Nights were cold and dangerous, but he pressed on, driven by an invisible force that whispered, "Keep going." When he arrived in Nairobi, the city was a towering maze of people, traffic, and towering buildings, nothing like the quiet villages he'd known. But Charles didn't flinch. He knocked on doors, swept floors, carried bags, washed dishes, anything to earn a few coins and a chance to stay off the streets. He never begged again. His work ethic stood out. Employers noticed. He was polite, honest, punctual. And slowly, opportunities opened up. One job led to another. One small promotion became 2. And by the early 1970s, after years of labor and sacrifice, Charles Muli had done something no one could have imagined. He bought a car. Not for show, not for status, but for work. That car became the seed of Millionaire, his first transportation company, a name that would soon echo across the nation, not because of how much it earned, but because of what it would one day become. He was no longer surviving, he was building. By the mid-1980s, Charles Mouley was a man transformed. He wore tailored suits, owned fleets of vehicles, managed multiple businesses, and walked into boardrooms where his name carried weight. His company, Millionaire Agencies, had grown from a single car to a thriving enterprise in transport, real estate, agriculture, oil distribution, and insurance. His life had shifted from sleeping under trees to staying in lavish homes. To many, he was the picture of success. But within him, something stirred, something loud in its silence. Each morning, as he drove to his offices or walked past polished storefronts, he noticed the children, dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, on corners, in alleys, barefoot, hungry, fighting for scraps, street children. He tried to ignore them at first. He had once been one of them, but he had left that life behind. He had earned his peace. But the universe doesn't forget the vows whispered in broken hearts. One day, a group of children approached him outside a supermarket. Dirty, thin, and desperate, they tugged at his sleeves, begging for food, money, anything. Charles looked into their eyes and saw himself. He saw that same emptiness, that same silent plea to be seen, heard, and held. He remembered what it was like to eat from trash bins, to be shoved away, to be invisible. He gave them food that day. But food wasn't enough. Not anymore. That night, he couldn't sleep. He walked through the halls of his mansion, surrounded by wealth and comfort, but feeling hollow. He stood in the silence and asked a question that would unravel everything he'd built. What is the purpose of my life? He thought of the riches, the respect, the power. And then he thought of the children. Not just the ones at the supermarket, but thousands across Kenya, sleeping in the dirt, scavenging, fearing each day more than the last. Suddenly, the cars, the bank accounts, the properties, none of it seemed enough. His success, he realized, was meant to be more than his own. He was being called, not by ambition, but by something far deeper. A divine summons, a return to his roots, not to suffer, but to lift those still stuck in suffering. In 1989, after days of soul-searching, prayer, and weeping, Charles Mouley made a decision that shocked even his closest confidants. He would walk away from his businesses. He would sell everything. He would devote his life to rescuing street children, not with donations, but with his very home, his hands, and his heart. People called him insane. They begged him to reconsider. "You've worked so hard to escape poverty," they said. "Why return to it voluntarily?" But Charles had already lived the script of wealth. He was now writing a new one, a story not about climbing higher, but about reaching down. When Charles Mouley announced he was selling his businesses to care for street children, people didn't just whisper. They shouted. Board members, friends, family, even church leaders. They pleaded with him to stop, warning he'd lose everything. His businesses were thriving, his family comfortable, his reputation untouchable. Why ruin that? But Charles was unmoved. He sold his companies, emptied his accounts, and opened the doors of his own home to the streets. At first, it was just a few children. 3 boys and 2 girls. They arrived with torn clothes, matted hair, and eyes too weary for their age. Many of them couldn't even remember how to smile. They were used to being beaten, abused, or ignored. Charles and his wife, Esther, didn't just feed them. They lived with them, tucked them into bed, helped them wash, held them when they woke up screaming from nightmares. These weren't visitors. They were family now. But it didn't stop at 5 children. Word spread. More came. 10, then 20, then 50. Charles converted every room in his home into sleeping quarters. The living room became a classroom. The garden became a playground. The kitchen never rested. There were days when they didn't have enough food, yet somehow no one ever went hungry. But with the growth came new challenges. The local community was skeptical. Neighbors whispered. Some accused him of trying to build a cult. Others warned that the children would bring crime and chaos. But Charles never fought back. He simply continued the work. He and Esther created a system: education in the morning, chores in the afternoon, prayers in the evening. Children were taught to read, to plant, to cook, and most importantly, to love. Many of them, for the first time in their lives, heard the words, "You matter." And something incredible began to happen. Children who had never held a pencil began to write poetry. Boys once feared as pickpockets became leaders and role models. Girls who had been thrown away began to dream of becoming doctors and teachers. Love, consistency, and discipline, things Charles never had as a child, became the foundation of his work. He knew what these children needed because he had once needed it too. But the house couldn't hold them all. So Charles bought land. In the countryside, a wide stretch of open space, far from the noise and skepticism of the city. There, under the Kenyan sky, with no construction crew, no blueprints, and no certainty, he and his growing team began to build something the country had never seen before: the Mully Children's Family. Not an orphanage, not a charity, but a home. A living, breathing community where children once discarded by society could rediscover their humanity, their voice, and their purpose. Brick by brick, child by child, the dream was taking form. And the world hadn't even noticed yet. Out on the vast countryside of Ndalani, Kenya, the sun bore down on a landscape that was, at first, more dust than promise. There was no electricity, no clean water, no buildings, just raw land, and a dream too big for most to understand. But Charles Mully saw what others couldn't: not just a place to build, but a place to grow. With no large donors and no government aid, the early days of Mully Children's Family, MCF, were built with faith, sweat, and the willing hands of children and volunteers. They cleared land with machetes, dug with shovels, cooked over firewood, shared everything. And still, the number of children kept rising. Hundreds came. Some were orphans. Some had escaped violent homes. Some had simply wandered, barefoot and hungry, until someone pointed them toward a man named Mully. Every child brought a story, and every story broke and healed hearts in equal measure. Mully refused to turn anyone away. When food ran low, he prayed, and food came. When classrooms filled beyond capacity, he built more with his own hands. Every challenge became a new chapter in his mission. The children weren't just being rescued, they were being restored. They learned to farm, to raise chickens and cows, to dig wells, to conserve water. MCF wasn't just a home, it became a model of self-sustainability. Charles introduced innovations unheard of in rural Kenya at the time: solar energy systems, aquaponics, tree planting for reforestation. While the world saw a man giving up everything, he was actually building something far bigger than himself: a future. MCF schools began producing top students. Graduates started earning scholarships to universities, some within Kenya, others abroad. MCF kids, once dismissed by society as lost causes, were becoming doctors, engineers, artists, pastors, and entrepreneurs, and the ripple effects began to show. Communities that once opposed MCF started sending their own children to be educated there. Villagers found employment. Agriculture flourished. The land that had once been dry and barren now fed thousands and bloomed with green life. Still, Charles remained grounded. He worked among the children, ate with them, swept floors, planted trees. Every child at MCF knew this wasn't just an organization. It was their family. And Charles Mully was their father. His biological children, once unsure of his choice to give everything away, had long since joined the mission. They became teachers, managers, caretakers, carrying forward the vision not as employees, but as heirs to a purpose. From dust and despair, Mully had grown something no one could contain. A revolution of compassion, sustainability, and second chances. And now, the world was beginning to notice. But Charles Mully wasn't chasing headlines. He was chasing hope for the child still hungry, still lost, still waiting for someone to say, "Come home." By the time the 2010s arrived, Mully Children's Family was no longer a small grassroots effort tucked away in the Kenyan countryside. It had become a beacon, a place whispered about in villages and studied in universities, a sanctuary known across continents, a living proof that a single act of love, repeated every day, could change not just lives, but legacies. International organizations began visiting to learn from MCF's model. Documentarians arrived to capture the story, unsure if people would believe what they saw. And in 2017, the world watched through tear-filled eyes as the film Mully premiered, revealing to millions the unbelievable, unforgettable truth that a boy once abandoned in the streets had become the father of thousands. But even as the world applauded, Charles Mully remained the same. He rose before dawn, walked the fields, hugged every child, prayed with them, listened to them, celebrated their victories, grieved their sorrows. He knew every name, every background, every miracle in progress under his care. For Charles, fame was irrelevant. What mattered was the child afraid to speak, finally standing up to read in front of a classroom. What mattered was the teen once addicted to glue, now mentoring younger boys on how to walk a different path. What mattered were the girls, so many girls, who arrived broken from abuse or neglect, and now smiled with confidence as they studied, ran, danced, dreamed. Healing was happening, daily, quietly, authentically. The MCF family kept growing. What began in one man's home now spanned multiple campuses, farms, schools, and vocational centers. From babies to teenagers, Mully's children were thriving and giving back. Some had become lawyers and returned to fight for children's rights. Others became social workers, teachers, pastors, farmers. But perhaps the most beautiful legacy was this. The rescued had become the rescuers. Children who once clung to life in alleyways now traveled into slums and villages, reaching out to others who were lost, sharing food, offering shelter, extending hands once clenched in fear. The cycle had reversed. Charles Mully didn't just build a refuge, he built a movement, a self-replicating force of healing and transformation, rooted in the simple, unwavering belief that every child matters. His story could have ended so differently. He could have grown bitter, invisible, lost to history. Or he could have remained a wealthy businessman, praised in corporate circles, and remembered for his financial achievements. But Charles chose the harder path, the lonelier one, the one lined with crying children, sleepless nights, and impossible odds. And in doing so, he rewrote not just his story, but the stories of over 18,000 children whose lives will echo for generations. As he walks today through the fields of MCF, silver now in his hair, joy in his eyes, and peace in his stride, Charles Mully doesn't need applause. He's already heard the only words that truly matter. From a child once left in the shadows, whispering softly as they hug him tight, Thank you for choosing me.